So Africa has four very unique characteristics that makes it much different from other continents. And those four are basically the wildlife that occurs in Africa, the uniqueness of the culture, and the large green spaces, belts, reserves, and also the fact that Africa has actually relative small footprint comparing to the rest of the world. So the African countries they're actually the guardians of these protected areas, and the future of these areas, these protected areas, hinges directly on the development of the tourism industry in Africa. Once again, I'm very fortunate to have been and still being exposed to all these different cultures of different countries in Africa. And there are some stories that are quite remarkable that stands out. But there are also some philosophical angles that stand out. So from the philosophical point of view, one of the things that always bugs me a bit is if you go into Africa, the African culture has a very small footprint. But we as Westerners we're actually spoiled that. Because we came with all sort of modernizations and greed and trying to teach Africans what to do. But actually we shouldn't have taught them what to do, because their culture is actually a preserving culture with a very small footprint. But that's a bit philosophical and a bit touchy maybe, but that's the way I experience it, and it's actually factual. On the other hand, if you go to real highlight stories of also African culture, but not philosophical, which is more real, the most remarkable story was when we had to relocate a rhino in Ivory Coast from a village where it ended up after the Civil War, and it unfortunately killed the chief at night when he went for a wee. The villagers were afraid that it might happen again with one of the kids, so they requested that we take it away. But they actually loved this animal, and after a long, ritual, and we undertook the translocation to another spot in a safe reserve, but there were also villagers living around the reserve. So the day after we put this rhino in the boma, another 200 villagers gathered around the boma, and I was quite afraid that this was going to end up in a big mess because of the noise. And they had huge speakers and megaphones, and they were talking in their language I couldn't understand. And then I thought, this is going to really go skew, when a guy appeared with a bottle of gin and a cup, and he was just making a big rain dance and speaking up to the guards and creating lots of noise, and he was dressed in a bright pink robe, and then he poured this gin into the glass, and I thought, now the trouble is starting. But then he started sprinkling the stuff onto the soil around him, and he was dancing and talking to the guards, and I asked the translator, what the hell is going on here? And that's when it changed. The translator said, this guy is talking to his ancestors, and he's blessing the soil and the ground where this rhino will live. And the purpose of this is to protect it, and the villagers to protect this animal. And that came from the heart, purely. Nobody asked them to do it, and that's African. often experience cases that are charity cases, where people can't afford, or institutions can't afford to pay the expenses of saving an animal, or the procedures that are carried out. And eventually, or initially, I actually tried to cover it from my own pocket, but then later on, when it became bigger and bigger, that wasn't possible anymore. So I created the African Wildlife Conservation Foundation, and the idea was to get other people involved to help support the charitable parts of more endangered species. Yeah, the organization was supposed to raise the funds, but it's quite difficult to raise funds because there are many organizations that try to do similar things. But in the worldwide, there are actually too many of these organizations, and not always have the pure agendas. And that's where I think the dilemma lies with conservation, also part of the dilemma, that a lot of conservation efforts are not pure conservation efforts. And a lot of the money that are raised goes for administrative purposes. In our case, we don't take any funding for administrative purposes. Everything that's raised goes purely into specific conservation projects. Maybe 100 or 200 years ago, when most of the wildlife was extinguished in Africa, small pockets of wildlife remained in some places. And those pockets were then taken into safe places like reserves, where they were bred under supervision. But because were small numbers of certain species, inbreeding takes place. So inbreeding is a narrowing of the band of DNA that is available. And that usually sort of inbreeds the bad characteristics as well. A vulnerability to disease, immunity, and fertility, those type of things. So now we have the ability to exchange the DNA of small pockets of populations throughout the country to prevent inbreeding. And that is specifically applicable to the cheetah populations, which has a very narrow band of DNA. And in the meta population, we have to very frequently exchange the genetics to prevent inbreeding. Recent introduction was the red-billed oxpeckers, which previously occurred in this part of the world. And they are small birds that eat ticks. And tick burdens in this part of the world is huge because of the high rainfall and the vegetation. Now, in the 1800s and the early 1900s, when cattle farmers moved into this area, they started using organophosphate dips to get rid of the ticks and to save the cattle, because without that, cattle would die. And that eradicated the oxpeckers. So before we started with this introduction, we went to all the cattle farmers, which are mostly dairy farmers around here, and explained to them, if we switch to oxpecker-friendly dips, which are all the pyrethroids, then we can control the ticks, but we give a chance for the birds to establish themselves and to breed. And the birds, once they're established, they will move out onto the cattle farms and control the ticks. And that will then lessen the need for the use of dips, which are poisoned. And that's beneficial for humans as well. So they all agreed. and Bob's your uncle. There we went. And the first batch have been released, and the second batch has recently been released. And they're surviving. And hopefully this season they will breed. And that's another magical, I think, conservation story, because humans also benefit from it. And the environment. So about 6 months ago, I was called out to an emergency, a cheetah emergency, on a reserve where a cheetah cub was lacking behind his siblings. They couldn't run after the mother, so I went there, and there was this sibling with a wobbly hind legs, and he was not coping with keeping up with the rest of the pride. So we mobilized it and brought it here for intensive care and for diagnostic purposes, and eventually we figured out that this was what they call brittle bone disease or paper bone disease. And that is where the cubs, when they have insufficient minerals and trace elements, develop bone deformities. And that causes a lot of pain, and that then eventually it leads to them getting lame. After about a week, figuring out what was the matter with this cub, I had another call, and there were 2 more cubs with similar problems. So we went and immobilized them and brought them here as well. And then we started the long treatment of picking up the pieces, literally, to supplement the minerals and the trace elements to get it back on its feet again. So it goes along with a lot of other treatments to suppress the pain and control the pain levels, so it can eat properly and it can move properly. And this cub is, they were 3. Initially there were 6 cubs in the litter, which is quite a large litter for cheetahs. And 3 of them developed this paper bone disease. Fortunately, the 2 that arrived later on, we caught very early in the onset of the disease, so we could reverse it quite successfully. But the 3rd one, which arrived initially, he was far advanced in this bone deformity. So he's still here with us, but fortunately he's making good progress, and he will eventually grow out of his bone problems. And then we will be able to release him again. The other 2 we put back with the mother, with their siblings, and she gladly accepted them. But this one is too old now to be accepted again. So he's going to go through the process of rewilding, where he will eventually go into a smallish 100 hectares rewilding camp with small prey, live prey, and he will use his instincts to start hunting again. So we will not teach him, he will teach himself, but he will be in an able environment where he will be able to start to learn to capture his prey. And then once he's done that successfully, he will be released onto a large reserve. And that's how the rewilding process works. So there are 2 possible causes of, well, there are many possible causes of paper bone disease, but you find the same thing in dogs, carnivores in general. So that could be inherited from a gene, or it could be a deficiency in the diet. If they have artificial diets, like in zoos where they fed chickens, that happens often. And then the 3rd thing, which was this case, was the mother had 2 sets of litters close to each other, too close. And she didn't have the time to replenish her own minerals in her bone structure. So when they secrete milk, they withdraw the minerals from her own bones, and that wasn't replenished because the litters were too close together. Me and Arnold went to an auction, and we were trying to purchase a very special looking antelope. But we were totally outbidded by some guy with much more money. And so we sort of sulked for a week, and then I called Arnold and I said, Arnold, next week I looked at the internet, Googled, said there's some more beautiful animals up in Senegal. So I said, Arnold, we're going to Senegal just to get over this emotional downsizing that we experienced in the auction. So we went there, and we tried to have a look at these special antelopes that were very highly endangered as well. And then the owners at that stage, they initially got South Africans to assist them to capture these animals, put them in a breeding project and a rewilding project. And then halfway through the project, the pilot was killed in a helicopter crash, and that's where the project sort of stalled. And after a couple of days there with the owners, they approached us to assist them. And we thought about it and grew up a budget, went back there and designed the project. And it's a wildlife restoration project, but based on tourism income. So we set up a whole reserve with the tourism accommodation, and that's how we sort of got involved in Senegal, and still involved there. So in Chad, for instance, there is a war-torn country, partially initially, but nowadays it's stabilized. But during the war with Libya, most of or all of the species of wildlife that occurred in the Sahara Desert were wiped out, between Chad and Libya specifically. And those are also highly endangered species. And the mission of African parks in Chad, in the northern parts, in a reserve called Enedi, is to restore the wildlife and thereby create a magnet to get tourism going, which will then create an income. That is the model. So our initial involvement there was to get the redneck ostrich, which is an endangered subspecies, back into the wild. That's where it started 2.5 years ago. And we captured some like 10-day-old ostriches in the south of Chad. There's a small population surviving in another park called Zakuma. So we took those up to Enedi. We flew them up in a small plane, bits by bits, and then raised them artificially. Taught the people there how to do it. There's a lady by the name of Elsa. She's in charge of this special project in Chad for African parks, and we were quite successful in raising those birds, and they have now recently been released in the desert. And this is the first batch that's been released. They're all fitted with satellite devices, so we can track them exactly where they go. And I actually just got news yesterday that they've laid their first clutch of eggs in the wild. And that's, we really feel we've been successful in the first stage. So the elephants at Botlierskop, most of them have been given a second chance in life. They were rescues, some of them were rescues from zoos, circuses, and orphans. But because they are now in a managed environment, we have to manage their behavior because they were negatively imprinted in their previous lives. So because elephants are prone to develop very high testosterone levels in captivity, but also in the wild, we have to manage those levels of testosterone. Otherwise, they go what in the Asian language called must, which is poisoned elephant. Their mind go poison. And we use the opportunity when controlling the must by injection of a vaccine to also collect these samples for the anti-cancer research, which Charlotte from the Itemba Labs is involved in.
So yeah, it has been discovered that elephants are cancer resistant. So they have multiple copies of a gene where we humans only have one gene of. So they have 20 copies of the gene and we have only one copy of that set of genes. And for us humans, it's a very important tumor suppressor gene. We also call it the guardian of the genome. So without the gene, it will be very difficult for us to survive. And it's also a gene that is mutated in almost 50% of human cancer. So it's the cause of a lot of cancers. So when this was discovered, we thought, okay, we have the answer why elephants are cancer resistant and why we humans develop cancer. The big problem is that, for instance, the function of this gene is known for a very long time already. But when you genetically modify a mouse, let's say, you can do that in a lab environment, that you just create a mouse or another animal that is small in a lab with 20 copies of that gene, it would only survive 1 week. Because the gene makes sure that you can't accumulate damage in your cells. So there's a very high rate of cell loss. So in 1 week, the mice or the rat, they reach the age of adulthood, and they just die because of old age, because they have such a high rate of cell loss. So this is now the very interesting part about elephants, because they live very long. They live up to 65, 70 years in the wild. So it's very comparable to humans actually. So this is now the question mark. So it can't only be the gene, because if we try that, it doesn't work. So that is why this project is quite important to do here in Africa, because you still have elephants that roam freely who are not exposed to human environment, and the answer must be a complex, it's not going to be simple. So it's not only the gene, it must also be environmental factors, and that is what we try to discover with this project. So up until now, we collected blood samples and skin samples, and we exposed these cells in our lab to radiation, because we know that radiation causes damage to cells, and then we compare how the elephant cells respond to that damage and how human cells respond to that damage. So the whole idea of the project is that by making this comparison, we can try to find more answers to this question, how they are cancer resistant, and then hopefully on the long term develop measures to prevent cancer in humans, or to treat the cancer in humans in a better way. Since that gene is mutated in so many cancers in humans, if we can get the key to the big question why elephants are cancer resistant, then we might find a solution for cancer in humans, or at least for some cancers. So that's the idea of the project.
I think that evolved from our younger days, and if you read the sort of statistics of children and the effects of early life towards later life, then children between 7 and 12 years, if they are exposed to green spaces, they later in life see nature as a magical space. But children that are not exposed to green spaces or to nature, they see nature as a hostile environment. And those two poles tell a story. And that's where we need to focus our efforts in conservation, because we can, for the short term, we can mend and put plasters and try to recover and restore nature for the damage that's done by humans. But for the long term, We have to create consciousness or awareness, and you can only create that with the youth. And according to the people that study these things, that happens between 7 and 12 years of age, which is very young. And if we don't focus on that, we're not going to win the restoration of or conservation of Earth. Yeah. So conservation, there are very little green spaces left on Earth, and one cannot exclude that and ring fence it completely. In a balanced conservation model in future, you will have to involve communities and people in a recipe that we have not refined enough. We still have to create the sustainability model where people and nature can respect each other and live together.